The summer of 1988 broke Greene County, Tennessee the way drought breaks things. Slowly, then completely. By mid-July, the grass had turned the color of old paper. Ponds were rings of cracked mud. Grown men whose fathers had held this land through the Depression, through the war, through every hard year in between, were loading cattle into trailers at a loss and driving away without looking back. Curtis, we sold 22 head in a single week. Earl's own brother Dale stood at the auction ring in August and watched 30 years of careful breeding walk away for 70 cents on the dollar. Hat in hand, eyes down, and 2 miles down a gravel road, on 83 acres that should have been just as dead as everything else in the valley, a herd of fat Hereford cattle lay in the shade, chewing cud, completely unbothered. The grass around them was green. How that pasture stayed alive while every other one in 3 counties turned to dust is a question that starts not in 1988, but 6 years earlier. On a cold morning, when Earl Renfro made a decision that made the entire town of Hollister Gap question his sanity. Here is what he knew that nobody else did. Earl Renfro was not the kind of man who explained himself. He had taken over his father Walter's farm in 1971, when Walter's heart gave out during hay season, just stepped into the work the way water fills a low place, without announcement. 60 head of Hereford on 83 acres, the same ground his father had cleared with a mule and a chain back in 1946. Earl cut the hay. He fixed the fence. He paid the bank on time, every January, for 11 years without missing a payment or making a speech about it. His hands told the story better than he did. Thick across the knuckle, scarred from wire and dibble bar and 30 years of machinery that didn't always cooperate. The kind of hands that don't wave around when a man talks. They stay in his lap or wrapped around a coffee cup, still. He was not a complainer. He was not a boaster. He was a man who thought about things for a long time before he said them out loud, and sometimes decided not to say them at all. That habit would cost him 6 years of his neighbors' respect. It would also save the farm. In the winter of 1978, Marlene Renfro won a trip in a Farm Bureau raffle. 2 weeks at a short course down in Athens, Georgia, at the university. Earl almost gave the ticket to his cousin. He was not a man who liked sitting in lecture halls, but he went. In a cold room that smelled like old coffee, he listened to a quiet professor from Missouri spend 3 hours describing something called silvopasture, trees and cattle on the same ground, at the same time. The professor showed slides. A farm in Argentina, a pasture in Spain, a small operation in Virginia where a man had been running this system for 20 years, and his cattle were gaining weight faster, his grass was lasting later into summer, and his soil was holding water the way a sponge holds water instead of the way hardpan clay sheds it. Earl did not raise his hand once during that lecture. He went back to his motel room and wrote 4 pages of notes by lamplight. In the hallway afterward, he stopped the professor and asked him one question. What kind of tree worked best on thin, acid soil in the Appalachian foothills? Loblolly pine, the man said, widely spaced. And you have to wait. Earl went home and didn't tell anyone. Not Marlene, not his brother Dale, not his neighbor Curtis, who shared his east fence line. He thought about it for 4 years. He ran the numbers in his head through 2 hay seasons and 3 cattle markets and 1 bad winter. And in January of 1982, he drove down to a forestry nursery outside Chattanooga and put $480 on the counter for 2,400 loblolly pine seedlings. The woman behind the counter asked if he was starting a Christmas tree farm. He said no. She asked if it was a timber plantation. He said no. She looked at him a moment, then rang him up without asking a third time. The seedlings came wrapped in wet burlap, each one no bigger than a pencil. You could hold 100 of them in one hand. They looked like nothing, green twigs with a white thread of root at the bottom. Earl and his 13-year-old son Wyatt planted every one of them by hand. A dibble bar, a long steel rod with a foot peg, row after row across 83 acres of good open pasture. 40 feet between rows. 12 feet between trees, wide enough for a tractor, wide enough for cattle to walk through, wide enough, Earl kept telling himself, for the grass to keep growing underneath. They worked from sunup to full dark for 11 straight days. On the 5th day, Marlene found Earl in the barn, bent against a post, unable to straighten his back, crying quietly from the pain. He took 2 aspirin and went back out. When his neighbor Curtis came by on the 8th day to borrow a post hole digger, he stood at the pasture fence and stared at the rows of foot-tall seedlings poking up through the grass. Then he said, "Earl, what in the name of God are you doing?" Earl wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "I'll tell you in 6 years, Curtis." Curtis laughed. He actually laughed out loud. Then he took the post-hole digger and drove home. By supper, the whole hollow knew. At the feed store, a man named Mel Buckner started calling him the lumberjack. At the diner on Route 11, someone drew a cartoon on a napkin, Earl riding a cow through a forest, and it hung behind the register for 2 years. At the Tuesday cattle auction, grown men stopped bidding to watch him walk past so they could nudge each other and grin. His brother Dale came to the fence in March and said, "You're going to lose the place, Earl. You know that, right?" And one night at the kitchen table, Marlene, who had stood beside him at the bank and the auction and through every hard season without complaint, asked him, very quietly, if he was feeling all right. Not angry, just scared. Earl took her hand. "Marlene, I am not sick. I need you to trust me for 6 years." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. That first summer, 412 of the seedlings died in an August dry spell. Earl walked the rows with a bucket in each hand, 2 gallons per tree, for 6 weeks. He lost 12 pounds. His hands split open and bled into the bucket handles. He replanted every dead one by October, and then he waited. The trees grew the way trees grow, indifferent to opinion, indifferent to the men at the feed store, indifferent to the cartoon on the napkin and the whispers in the church parking lot. By year 3, they were chest high. By year 4, they were over Earl's head. Dale stopped coming by entirely. Curtis told his wife at dinner that Earl's pasture was starting to look like a Christmas tree lot, and what a damn shame it was. But something else was happening, something quiet, something Earl tracked alone in the spiral notebook he had been keeping since 1982. The grass under the young pines was staying green later into summer, an inch longer than the open pasture, then 2 inches. By year 5, 4 inches. The cattle had stopped standing panted and miserable at the pond at midday. They were bedding down in the shade instead. At weaning in the fall of 1986, Earl's calves came off 21 pounds heavier on average than they had in 1981. 21 pounds a head, 60 head, almost $800 a year, arriving quietly, without fanfare, into the farm ledger. Earl dug a shovel into the soil under the pines in the spring of 1987. What came up was dark and crumbly, full of decomposing needles, soft enough to hold a shape when he squeezed it in his fist. 5 years before, that same ground had been red clay so hard you could barely break the surface. Nobody walked that pasture with him. Nobody knew. He was in year 5 of a 6-year plan. Then came the summer of 1988. The rain stopped in late April. By June, the creeks were low. By the end of June, the ponds were gone. By mid-July, the grass across every open pasture in Greene County had turned the color of a paper bag, and walking across a hayfield, you could hear it crunch under your boots like broken glass. The governor came on the radio. The Extension Office declared a Level 3 agricultural emergency. Farmers drove 40 miles to fill tanks at municipal hydrants and paid by the gallon. Curtis sold 22 head at a loss of nearly $400 each because he couldn't feed them and couldn't watch them starve. Dale stood at the auction ring in August and watched 30 years of careful breeding walk away for 70 cents on the dollar. Men in Hollister Gap were crying in their trucks. On a Thursday afternoon in the first week of August, a cattle buyer from Knoxville named Raymond Hess missed a turn on Route 11. He drove 2 miles down a gravel road, looking for a place to turn around, and came up over a rise and stopped his truck in the middle of the road. In front of him, across 83 acres, was green pasture. Green. In August. In the worst drought anyone in that valley could remember. Long rows of pine trees, 30 feet tall, casting afternoon shadows across grass that was still somehow growing. And beneath those trees, 60 head of Hereford cattle, fat and calm, chewing cud in the shade. One old bull lay on his side with his eyes closed, flicking flies with his tail. Raymond Hess had been buying cattle for 26 years. He had driven every back road in East Tennessee. He stood at the fence for a long time. Then he drove up to the house. Earl was on the porch with iced tea. They walked the pasture for 2 hours. Raymond asked questions. Earl answered them, plain and slow, without bragging, without any trace of the victory he had earned. He showed Raymond the soil. He showed him the weaning weights in the spiral notebook. He showed him where the trees had died and where he had put new ones in. Halfway across the field, Raymond stopped walking. He took off his cap. "Mr. Renfro," he said, "you didn't just survive this drought. You solved it 6 years ago." Earl nodded once. He didn't say anything else. Stories travel in cattle country slowly, and then all at once. By September, trucks were parked along the gravel road in front of the Renfro farm every weekend. Farmers from 3 counties standing at the fence, not laughing, just looking at the green grass and the pine rows and the calm cattle, and then driving home without saying much to each other. That fall, a researcher from the University of Tennessee named Dr. Althea Mowing arrived with a graduate student and a clipboard. She spent 3 days on the farm, measuring soil moisture, canopy cover, grass height at 14 points, the weight of 6 calves. She asked Earl if she could publish what she found. "Tell it however you need to tell it," he said. "Just tell it right." The paper came out in the spring of 1989, 31 pages, full of words Earl didn't use. But the last page had a chart he understood perfectly. His pasture had retained 43% more soil moisture during the 1988 drought than any comparable open pasture in the region. That winter, we came up Earl's driveway for the first time in 4 years. He stood on the porch with his hat in his hand and would not meet Earl's eyes. "Earl," he said, "I've been a fool. Come on in, Curtis." Marlene made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Before Curtis left, he asked where Earl had bought his seedlings. Earl wrote the nursery's name on the back of a feed receipt and handed it across the table. Curtis planted 600 loblolly pines in his south pasture the next spring. Dale planted 400 the year after. By 1993, there were 11 silvopasture operations in Greene County. By 1997, more than 40. Earl Renfro ran cattle on those 83 acres until his hips gave out in 2004. Then he sat on the porch and watched his son Wyatt run them. Wyatt runs them still. The pines are 60 feet tall. The soil beneath them is black and deep. When the drought of 2007 came, worse in some ways than 1988, the Renfro pasture stayed green, the way it always does. Earl died in the winter of 2019. Wyatt had his father's ashes scattered among the oldest row of pines, the ones they had planted together with a dibble bar when Wyatt was 13 years old, and the whole valley was laughing. At the funeral, Dr. Althea Mowing, old herself by then, stood up and said something that people wrote down. She said Earl Renfro was not a genius. He was not a scientist. He was a cattleman who was willing to be laughed at for 6 years because he could see 1 year further down the road than anyone else in the valley. In the feed store in Hollister Gap today, nobody laughs when a young farmer mentions planting trees in his pasture. The old men just nod. And sometimes one of them leans over quietly, like he is sharing something valuable, and says, "Drive out past the Renfro place. Take a look at what Earl did back in '82. Everyone in that valley saw trees. Earl Renfro saw the drought that hadn't arrived yet." Earl never needed anyone to believe him. He just needed enough time to be right. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who's being laughed at for a decision nobody else understands yet. And if you want more stories about the farmers who saw further down the road than the rest of us, subscribe. We tell one every week.